Hello. How is everybody doing? Hope everyone is doing well. I am so glad to see everybody here. And let's see here. Welcome to the Shakespeare Show. I guess we can call it that for right now. I hope everybody's doing well. Um, just wanted to make sure that everything is sounding okay. So like I said, I hope everybody's doing well. For today's stream, I wanted to go over the last of the most recent GigaChad videos that we have available for us to enjoy, because they definitely bring a certain type of joy, that's for sure. I wanted to go over that. And then I wanted to finish the video with Ignatius Donnelly, and possibly look into the into the Giza pyramid and the other pyramids at Giza, right, in the Giza necropolis, as power plants, right, like the ancient power plant hypothesis. I thought that would be interesting to go into and sort of go into like bad history stuff. So that's what we'll be going over today. Another thing too is I will be getting some food very soon, so hopefully won't have to cut the stream so early as I usually do, because I have to go make myself dinner. So I'm hopeful that we will make it through all of the videos for today. Because I know my stream, sometimes it's like, oh, I get so hungry, I'm just like, I just need to go make myself some food right now. And I just have to. Like, I'm just like so hungry. Then I also have to feed my puppies too, so I always have to keep them in mind. Another thing too was, of course, if you'd like to support me in any way, particularly with my research, yes, very much so. Very, very important. If you'd like to help me in any way, you can always go to my throne and help me out with getting texts that are important for my research, or as well as my link tree, which is also available here if you put in. I think I'll probably pin this one instead. Yeah. If you'd like to help me out in any way, you can always go to my link tree, and there are the many different ways you can help me. So without further ado, we can start with the content. Okay. Also, Chromatic Mage, can you please let me know if it's doubling my voice, because it might be doing that, but I want to make sure it's not. Okay, so because sometimes it does that. It will double register my voice for whatever reason. It decides that it's going to double it for, I don't even know why. But okay, never mind. I figured out how to do it now. So as I said before, we're going to be going over GigaChad and the crisis of masculinity that he's going through, or rather, the one that he purports to talk about. And that's what we're going to focus on for right now.
Betty, and welcome to the first episode of the broadcast from the underground. Joining me.
Also, I think it's funny, like, the fact that they had to put a sword behind them. Like, if we didn't have any more proof of the fact that this is like a masculine podcast, here is literally a sword unsheathed, right, outside of a window, for our podcast named The Underground, which, it's like, I get it. Like, I get the desire to want to name it like Underground, but it's like, I've never seen. Another thing too is like to have all the lighting and stuff like in picture. Like, I kind of get it, right? Like, I know I have like light that's kind of off screen, right? That you can sort of see where it comes from, but like, I don't know. It's like kind of like, because of where the camera's situated, you can barely really see the effect. But that's neither here nor there. But I think to me, the sword is what sticks out to me the most. But now we know that Giga Chad does have a friend, and now he has started a podcast. So
Today is my cameraman and fellow philosophy enthusiast right here, and today we're going to be talking about the current crisis of masculinity and how we can inspire true heroism once more in our boys.
A couple days ago, I came across a post about Sneeko, about how he is, in the eyes of the left, poisoning our youth. And I hate to say it, but I kind of agree. I feel like Sneeko and Tate aren't exactly the best role models for our young boys. But at the same time, I feel like they came to power because there is a vacuum of that sort of heroism that young men could strive to be like. In my childhood, I looked up to knights and Winston Churchill.
In fact, yes, I remember back in the day reading my Prince Valiant comics, my whole collection of 25 of them, these massive books. But these were compilations of pretty much an ancient knightly tale, essentially, inspired by, the world of King Arthur. And what it
I just have to say, I find it really funny that they're talking about like our boys, right? Like our children, as if they themselves have children. Now, as far as I know, Giga Chad does not have any children. Um, and he's not like that old. So it's kind of strange when like you get this like, yes, we need to talk about the problem that's happening in our current time with our kids, right? Like we need to talk about our children. But I do find it just like, I don't know. I just find it very strange to me to also talk about like the Tate brothers coming to power because they didn't I mean, like, I understand what perhaps they're referring to, right? In the sense of, oh, like they became very popular and very well known and had an effect in the world, sure. But it's kind of weird to think about them like being in power because I just can't, like, like, I don't know, just like thinking about that is, but also like of all the choices, of course they're going to choose Winston Churchill, who is like, no. And then medieval knights, particularly fictional medieval knights, that were, like the entire like story of King Arthur and everything. It's like it's really strange for people to like try to bring that back as like this is what people used to read and like be inspired by when it's like there's really like the main historical, well, I'll put it like this. The interesting literary and historical evidence we have of people reading those type of romances as they were called back then is like one example would be Don Quixote, right? Where Don Quixote read them so much that he ends up LARPing as a knight, right? We perhaps did not necessarily use that terminology back then, but that's essentially what he does, right? Like that's what the story is about. It's about a knight, an hidalgo, right, who has lost, who has a title of nobility but owns no real land, right? Doesn't really own anything, doesn't really have anything, right, to his name, but has read a lot of romances and because of that decides to go on a long quest, right? To go find Dulcinea, right? And it is a foundational text in what is often called the Western canon, often thought of as like the first real novel, et cetera, et cetera. But like the example of like people like, oh, our young kids were reading like La Mort d'Arthur and other such texts is like, I don't know, like I feel like it's very, very overstated, mainly because that's a 19th century thing. Like in the 19th century, people took the medieval romances and like really, really took them to a new height, right? Where they really placed an enormous importance on them, right? By far a greater importance than they ever had, necessarily in their own time. In fact, in many cases, people regarded, right, the medieval romances as being somehow an inferior literary form. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they are, but rather that they were like a bad imitation of the classical epic, right? So I don't know. Like to me, it's very strange to then be like, oh well, this should be I don't know. It's just very strange to me.
Taught, although it did dabble in certain issues, like even feminism at some points, it always kept its kind of heroic ideal of a man, and always kept the good, strong father who fought for his king and had values. And that's what I grew up on. But again, like you said with the vacuum, current masculinity finds itself in a complete void of role models. Because all our heroes of the past, they've been torn down by the left because they're feared. They represent strength, and they represent a kind of strength that the modern left is founded fundamentally against, because pretty much ever since really the Second World War, liberalism has been in complete reaction to anything that the fascists of the mid 19th century, of the mid 20th century, stood for. For example,
I mean, yeah, that's kind of like basics. Yes, liberalism, which totally didn't enable fascism and was okay with it, for the entirety of its existence. Get better heroes, right? It's like it's so weird too to be like feminism caused this problem. But another thing is like to take issue with it because it's like the issue is that liberalism went against fascism, right? Like that's a weird take, right? Like the left, which he's including liberalism with, which again doesn't make any sense. Like the only thing he technically gets right, and I'm only gonna say technically because I guess semantically he gets right, is that liberalism is reactionary. Technically, he is correct in that, but it's not reactionary in the way he thinks it is, right? So that makes this like whole thing just even stranger because feminism's so much more powerful than his weak beta male heroes, right? Like that's the thing is like leftism is both like so infinitesimally like tiny and weak and could never actually go against the heroes, but also it has all of this power and can somehow has edged you know has essentially just found a way to marginalize, right, to I guess try to I don't know, like remove our heroes, right? Like this is kind of like the logic that goes behind the like this is why we shouldn't. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, comrade. Welcome in everybody. Welcome in Leaping Larry comrades. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm Shakespeare. I'm a cultural historian and I am also a leftist streamer just like Leaping Larry. And you are, of course, all welcome. Chat, please make sure to help us all in making sure to follow Larry, as I've already shouted out. And thank you all again so much, Larry, for rating me. I truly appreciate it, comrade. How was your stream? I hope it all went well. I saw it earlier. Looked fun. Thank you very much, everybody, for the follows. I appreciate it. Welcome in. Welcome in. We're just going over apparently the crisis of masculinity that occurred when liberalism started being against fascism. Apparently, like that's what these traditionalists are saying was the problem. Is like we would have better male role models if liberalism. Yes, welcome in. Like that's literally what his thesis is that because fascism was opposed by liberalism, we have bad male role models and that is causing the crisis in masculinity. So that's where we're at right now. So everybody just buckle up and make sure to refresh, that way you're counted in as a viewer.
like the whole strongman ideal, that was completely torn down simply to avoid that happening again. It was simply out of fear that we went wholly against it, but we are unwilling to really moderate the two, to find the happy medium where we can.
I like that, like, what we need is it's like that idea, right? It's like we need strong men, right? Instead of like a strong men dictatorship, right? But it's like, but also we have to moderate it because otherwise, like, liberalism will oppose it somehow. Like I just don't. Oh my goodness! Thank you so much, Chromatic Mage, for gifting a tier 1 sub to our comrade, Leaping Larry. Hello, Tybalt. Welcome in. Welcome in. So glad to see everybody in here. Um, so again, like it's such a strange way to position liberalism and fascism, to say that liberalism is a reaction to fascism, or rather that masculinity is in crisis because liberalism is in reaction to fascism, and that's why like we got rid of strong men, strong men, right? I'm going to put a hyphen in that. Strong men, right? Or just put them together as one word, strong men, and decided instead to go for the exact opposite, which is totally untrue. If anybody has ever done like installed more dictatorships and upheld fascism more, I mean, the liberal West is perhaps the best example of that. I feel like we have had bad male role models because these delusional man children are afraid to write themselves a love letter in the caliber of their choice. I mean, like if you, I mean, so I understand that this is your first time chatting here. Like we've been going over biased histories, as we call him, Giga Chatty. We actually have an emote of him here, on my stream, and he's just like went from like like we went over the his video on the decline of the West and the future of Europe, and how apparently like leftists are against going to the gym because leftism is against the noble origins of it, which doesn't even make any sense because neither liberalism nor socialism, right, as we understand it, even existed back in the days of when the gym first existed. Yes, that's exactly it. That is our Giga Chad emote, which I just found out that Twitch now apparently is now allowing a whole bunch of more um, animated emotes. So if anybody wants to help me in getting a Wiggler and some other animated emotes, I would appreciate that help because it has been so hard to I don't know why. I just love dancing emotes. Biased history is a constant embarrassment to himself. The king of cringe. Yes, his like he's like I would love to be an 18th century what's it called, English gentleman, but also his family invented pasta, like literally invented like linguine, and so he's claimed, right? And like brought electricity to Italy. So
Have young men reach their best and not go fully to the extremes that we saw in the mid 20th century that caused such chaos.
I'm a little less.
Also, it's a weird thing to say, and I apologize if it was doubling right now. I need to learn how to use this microphone set. But it is a weird thing, though, to say that what happened in the mid 20th century in Europe, who says something like, I would love to live a millionaire in a world that didn't have flush toilets? I mean, people forget that about Versailles. It's like when you visit Versailles, there are no bathrooms in Versailles. Like the ones that, like, that's why when you do go there and you visit, they're tiny and they're like cut out of the, like people would just like squat down behind the like columns and just like leave their leavings there. I don't know how else to put it. They would just do that. And that was, uh, that apparently was the height of civilization, according to GigaChad. But yes, I love dancing emotes. Yeah, especially NCCs. I like that it's like a full on like dance. But I really want a Wiggler, because I always feel like like I don't know, but yeah, it's so weird though to call what happened in Europe in the middle of the 20th century just chaos, like because that makes me think of Jordan Peterson, right? Like, oh, there's like the dragon of chaos, right? And it's like, no, that can very easily slip into very bad types of denial. I'll just put it like that, right? Like, oh gosh, I feel like he has really, really sussy views about that too, about the events in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Just put it like that. Because I mean, he loves Evola, who said that the problem with fascism was that it was too progressive. So, I don't know. I feel like we all know what a good role model uh, is now that we are adult. We have some sort of notion, right? But we have all had bad role models and good ones. Um, um, I feel like we live in a society that knows this but does nothing to change the social structure. Oh yeah, of course. I mean, like hyper focusing on male role models is just a way to completely ignore the fact that there are far greater, I mean, by many degrees of magnitude problems with the material conditions, the social conditions, etc., right? That just compound, right? Depending upon whether you lived in, I mean, regardless of whether you live in the global north or the global south, right? Like, I mean, I've lived in the imperialized world for a long time, and I can tell you, like, the magnification of problems would not have been solved by having a good male role model, right? Like, so it's like that's why I find it very strange to be like to then use fascism as the example. Like, I don't know. It's just a strange way of doing that. YouTube historians don't be fash apologists challenge impossible. I know it is impossible. Like that's why when I find one that's actually an academic, they are like, well, you need to read this, right? And like they come off as like for example, like we're gonna watch a video of David Miano's soon or after this, and like he specifically talks about like bad history, which I personally like as a historian, right? It helps. It's a good way to then talk about good historical practice, right? Um, and for me, it's just like so fascinating to see how many people start to just like become apologists in some weird way. It's just it's just ridiculous because they want to think of history as just this like amalgamation of like discrete facts, right? Which they think are like static for the rest of time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, oh, these people live in this delusional world where Europe at any given time wasn't practicing, well, I mean, the worst hygiene ever seen in total barbarism socially. I mean, again, it's this, I mean, that's why he claims to be of nobility, right? Like he claims to be of like Italian nobility. He literally claimed to be of a ruling family, right? Of a monarchy, of a city state in Italy that never had a monarchy. I'm not even joking. Like literally said, my family ruled Siena. Siena never had a monarchy. So like there's no way that those two things can exist at the same time, right? I know, but he did. He said that. He said my family ruled this town or this city state. They never had one. They never had a monarch. Whenever they were an independent state, they were what were the Italian nobility up into the 30s? That's why his obsession with Ivola, who also was Italian nobility, and said fascism, like the reason why he didn't like fascism is because it was too progressive. And now he's saying this, right? Like, oh, like it was just chaos. It was just, makes me think that he has some very, very, yeah, interesting opinions. Interesting opinions. Yes, I was just wanting to say this. We all see a problem, but we are totally disagree on why it is so. It is so weird. Yeah, it is totally weird because people don't understand, right? That like you need to understand you like in order to really approach history, right? You can't act as though things exist outside out of ideology, right? And that's a very hard thing for like liberalism likes to tell itself, and it teaches us, right? Those of us who live in the world, right? That like liberalism is the outside of ideology, right? That like it accesses the actual human nature and all of that stuff, right? And it doesn't. Like it just isn't true. So, getting past that, especially in the imperial core, is just like instead reproduces itself in this then desire to legitimize, right, the capitalist structures, especially by appealing to feudal structures, right? This is very common. This is why the bourgeoisie, like in fact, you can read Jane Austen in Sense and Sensibility. This was the case, even all the way up to the 20th century with E.M. Forster's uh, Howard's End, right, where the bourgeoisie are seen being in opposition, or rather, yeah, being in opposition, one could say, to the landed aristocracy, right? That is, hereditary, goes back a long time, and instead they end up marrying, but it's marriage for the name, right? It's marriage for the nobility, and that is a phenomenon that is, again, which uses the feudal institution of marriage as it exists in Europe, right, to then advance capitalist aims. But if you put it in those terms, then people are going to say, oh, but blah blah blah, right? It's not those things. It's this, right? But we have to understand that nobody exists outside of ideology, and that is the hardest thing to, because with liberalism especially, is that the more right wing, right? I mean, even fascism does this, where it tries to think of itself as somehow being revelatory, right? When it's not. It literally doesn't. That's why it has to steal language from the left, because Marxism actually has things that can ground you in a materialist understanding of history, that can explain things. So yeah, he's delusional. I know. So this is when I can only go back to logic and say you need to rethink. Well, see, that's exactly what you would expect. But instead, you hear, well, ever since about 40 years ago, Italy stopped being a country because, they started letting the Communist Party run, Emilia Romagna, as he would say, right? I'm, of course, doing my, and that's essentially what he said. Because, my great-grandfather-in-law, right, he invented fettuccine, linguine, all of that stuff. He brought the electricity to Italy. He only drives Ferrari. You know what I mean? Like, that's the vibe he tries to give off, right? Sounds sus to me. Yeah, of course. I mean, it is sus. But the fact that this is, like, as the chat that's been here for quite a while, since I started streaming, will realize and will recognize is, like, earlier in his career, I guess, if we can say that, because Gigachad wants to be a historian. Like, that's why he's called biased history, because that's what he's trying to get a degree in, right? He's trying to become a historian. Is that at first he was against fascism, at least in the one sense, right? But it just doesn't go, right? At some point, it just doesn't follow, right? At some point, you have a fundamental point where this appeal to feudal notions that are at any rate, right, 19th century reconstructions of feudal notions, which is what I was talking about earlier, right? Is that, like, his idea of, like, the knights errant and reading the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I mean, that is something that only really became important or seen as important in the 19th century, right, during nationalism, right? And that is particularly evident in perhaps the defining novel, right, of the historical novel, literally seen as the foundational one, which is Waverley, right, by Sir Walter Scott, where it's literally set in the medieval past, and that is supposed to differentiate, right, them, right, the Scottish people, right, as a nation, as opposed to the English nation, right? But it's not based in reality, right? It's based on this idea of the past, which, I mean, I've brought up multiple sources before, and I usually do bring up my sources just because I think it's interesting, as, like, there are multiple historians that talk about how we are creating the history by remembering, right? By historicizing, we create the history itself. And, like, through that, particularly Tuyo, right? In his book, the darker side of Western modernity, the darker side of the Renaissance, right? Where he essentially shows how like our ideas of what the Renaissance are not in any way tied to any fact claims about the Renaissance, right? It's this late 18th and 19th century idea of what the Renaissance represented, what it signified for Europe, right? In particular, the rebirth being tied directly to colonialism, right? So it is sus, but the truth is so hard to find these days. Oh yeah, completely. I can't help but love Jane Austen, but she is very colonialistic. Well, yeah, I mean, like, especially the way how she describes, right, like the colonies, quote unquote, right? Like, oh, well, they're out there in the Bahamas, right? Or, Bermuda or whatever it might be, right? Um, there's also another aspect, too, where a lot of that has to also do with this idea of miscegenation, right? The idea that the Caribbean colonies, right, like particularly with Jamaica, right, Barbados, etc., right, represent something that whiteness, right, English and well, whiteness as a concept, right, is particularly juxtaposed against, right? Like that's one of the things that her images of, as to quote another novel actually, the rural simplicity of England was created as a foil to the quote unquote simplicity of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, right? So, because a lot of those myths are where like racialization began, right? And in Jody Melamid's book, Represent and Destroy, it's like racialization is power, right? Like it is power being expressed. So when Jane Austen is doing that, it is an act of like it is a colonial act. So I think to me you're right to say that she's being very colonialistic because she is, right? She's racializing people that go to the as it was called then the West Indies, right? So old money versus new money, but past a certain point, it's all just money. Well, definitely now. Like this belief that, oh, we need to make this distinction between the like upper class and the lower upper, like that's just, I mean, that's just appealing um, to various notions of, I mean, that is more a question of whiteness, right, than of money itself, um, because so many people have been assimilated into whiteness, and money can, to some extent, buy you whiteness, right? But there is, of course, in the imperial core, right, like, right, it's an ideological question for sure. This is why we need history. Um, Fascism is like an autoimmune disease, constantly mutating to mimic whatever superficial trappings. Did I switch microphones? No, I didn't. But I maybe. Okay, I think it should be out off now. I hope. Fascism is like a autoimmune disease, constantly mutating to mimic whatever superficial trappings it needs to get popular support for the moment, be it liberal or socialist. Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, it has been a reverb. Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, one of these dials, I guess I must have clicked it on accident because I usually don't. I usually don't turn them all on, but yeah.
I'll phrase it like this. I'm a little more moderate than you are, and I disagree on some of those points. I think that, for me, in my opinion, liberalism and true masculinity can coexist. But I think the reason, like, new liberalism and honestly some parts of new conservatism are against true masculinity is because that sort of strength, that sort of independence, kind of goes against the rhetoric of what we have in America today. The sort of pick a side and do everything that side says, don't question it mentality.
Yeah, it completely goes against this.
That is such a weird way to put that. New liberalism. I mean, because there is neoliberalism, right? That is a real thing. But and neoconservatism. But they are not against patriarchy. Like I don't know what on what planet this dude is on, but they are not against patriarchy and reproducing the exact same things, right? It's like people think that, oh, just because like capitalism is now willing to expand its horizons slightly in terms of like what people it will try to commodify, right, and commodify for, that somehow that equals like, I don't know, like that somehow that makes it seem as though that they're against it, but they're definitely not against masculinity, or at least the idea of masculinity, right? Like they uphold it by far the most because that's what upholds the same. You know what I mean? Like this is why I think that the base superstructure understanding is like a really good and basic thing to be taught, that can even be taught in such a way that like I would say even like younger people, right, could understand, right, that like the material conditions affect the superstructure, right, the ideological superstructure, but also that the ideological superstructure informs and, right, because it the economic base wants to reproduce itself, right? It's like this doesn't make sense if you understand that that's how it works. But if you think it's like, oh, because now we have more commodification and more instrumental reason, I guess, just to think of Horkheimer's understanding of this, that somehow that means that they're against whatever this thing is. I don't know. That's such a weird way of talking about that. I don't know, at least in my opinion. But um, okay. I will leave this playing while I go get some food. I will be right back.
System. Because championing the individual is fundamentally what every government will be against, especially in the modern day. Because governments now are, as I mentioned before, inspired by fear. They rule by fear, and they can keep encroaching on the rights of the individual and individual freedoms because the fear of the population is motivating them. For example, how do politicians win elections? They inspire fear of a enemy, or they inspire fear of even a different, a different section of your own country. The left inspires fear of the right, while the right takes on the fear of the left, and all that serves to do is to take away our rights and convince the population to blindly follow these politicians, whose only real goal is to further the agenda of themselves and their party.
I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, what is one person or one ideal that modern men, and modern young men specifically, should be looking up to?
See, I've always been a big fan of the idea of monarchs, and because not only because monarchy as a whole is a very stable system, which I've explained before, but also because having a monarch put in a situation that they can't choose, yet still rising to meet the occasion, I find to be so inspiring, really. With monarchy and aristocratic ideals as a whole, it's not through your own merit during your youth that you have to rise to the occasion. And for a king, if a king, let's say in the Middle Ages or the early modern period, did not rise to the occasion, did not meet his kingly duties, it is very likely that one of the ravens circling around him would take him out. Whether that be a revolt of the people or a revolt of the aristocracy. And so truly, I find that the kings of these periods, at least the ones that are successful, I find them to be the ultimate role models, because rather than having work to get to a point, they had to jump in that head first. When they were children, they had to fight for their seat. And I think that level of responsibility and that level of duty to a nation is incredibly remarkable. That's why men like Peter the Great, he's a great example.
Has he been reading Mold Book? Oh my gosh. I feel like it. I mean, he's definitely has like he is a person that's like I'm all for tradition, and will even bring up a certain philosopher from who lived in Montana, known for a manifesto. I will just leave it like that. But then it's like he only talks in memes, so the fact that you bring that up, yeah, probably, most likely, because I know that when I left, he was talking about the state. He's got Nick Landbrain. Yeah, yes, I definitely, yeah. It's like, but you can tell though that he's never read Nick Land, right? Like, it's not Nick Land from Fang Numina or from anything, right? It's like, it's from like Moldbug. It's from 4chan. It's from something else, right? It's not actually the thing itself. Yeah, yeah.
He was a huge, physically imposing man. He was truly the ideal man. And although I don't agree with all his reforms to westernize Russia so fully, what he did stand for is a change in Russia in bringing a new and very hardened, very firm military standpoint into Russia. It pretty much took Russia out of a
Again, like the desire for fascism in this is so apparent. It's not even funny. Like like the whole Peter. Well, he actually just said, right, that Peter Great was the greatest man of all time. I can't think of anyone who actually believes that. And I'm actually surprised that he chose Peter the Great because I don't know. Like I would imagine he would have said literally anybody else, but not Peter the Great. But like it's funny because now apparently he's against westernization. But then what would Peter the Great be known for if not the reformer? Right? Like wasn't that his whole thing? I don't know.
muddled aristocracy that it was bogged down in before, and took it to be one of the great monarchies in Europe. Peter the Great single-handedly made Russia feared, defeated Sweden, defeated many others, and expanded Russia's border, while also, creating the city of St. Petersburg, now, which is truly one of the two central cities of Russia. And I definitely think that although he did have his share of violence and atrocities, as every monarch does.
Of course.
What he managed to do and the kind of masculinity he championed is something that I think every man can look up to.
I don't know about that. I don't know. I don't know if someone who it's like first the fact that it's like yeah, of course, yeah, like atrocities, of course. That doesn't I don't know, that just doesn't vibe with me, but that's such a weird way of putting it too, like that's the type of masculinity that we need is the kind it's his cameraman that he's now employing to be his like the person because this is for his new podcast that he's only made currently one episode of. But he's definitely trying to go for like the Steven Pinker look, but I don't know, like that's just such a weird way of saying it. Like, well, what is so great, what made Russia so great was that it became such a no, no, no. It's his cameraman. He just needed someone to like have there, so I guess like the only other time he's really shown friends was when he had himself dressed up with a Pickel helm or like the Prussian helmet, that people are usually know, and like had his friends like his like dorm mates or whatever like bowing to him and like you know what I mean. It was like very strange. It was like this very strange experience.
What about you?
For me, I mean, I know I mentioned it earlier, but I think Winston Churchill has always been an icon for me. That sort of mentality of even when the whole world is against you, you plant your feet and stick to your ideals. You stick to your country, you stick to your family, you stick to the people you serve, and you.
When was the whole world ever against Winston Churchill? Like, that is literally just not even true. Like, Winston Churchill had the entire British establishment. I mean, like, he got, like, voted out for someone else. Yeah, like, is that the whole world? Is just the Axis powers? Is the I don't know. That's just like, and stand your ground and whatever, blah blah blah. It's like the people you serve. Yeah, I'm so sure that Winston Churchill was thinking about the people that, of course, were represented, quote unquote, by the colonial office. I'm pretty sure. I'm fairly sure that he thought of those that depended on him, especially during the events in Bengal, to put it lightly.
Sort of plant a wall.
Mm-hmm.
You draw the line and you do not let anyone pass that line. I respect that more than anything else.
Definitely.
I don't think I know nearly enough about European monarchy to add on to any of your points, but I look forward to hopefully talking more about that with you.
Oh, surely. And Churchill is definitely a good example. But what Churchill is also a prime example of is how the left want to tear down these men for young boys to look up to.
I would agree.
And what the left is doing is, to do this, they're once again relying on fear.
Are there any young men or boys that look up to Winston Churchill? Like, Winston Churchill is such like a boomer meme. Like, oh yes, the greatest statesman and blah blah blah. It's like, who believes that? Like, no one believes that. Like, boomers believe that, I guess, but like, nobody I know, nobody younger really thinks that. Like, he doesn't have the same prestige as he had before. But probably Tories. Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's like the one person they can go back and be like, see, this person did the right thing. Um, Young conservative English. Well, yeah, sure. I guess, yeah. But it is very strange, though, to say that he drew a line and didn't let anybody cross it, because that's also not true. I mean, his line was like, he wanted more war, right? Like, for him, war was a good thing. I mean, that's what he kept doing, right? That's what he didn't mind that. And that's just proven by historical example. But also, I find interesting is that they're saying that the left makes people afraid of having them as, like, these are very standard right-wing talking points, but they also don't, but like, having to actually think through them and try to, like, well, what, like, think of a situation where they would be true, I guess is one way of putting it, does not make sense logically, because what does one have to do with the other? If these people were these prestigious, right, great men of power, why would the left have to instill fear in the rest of society to make people somehow be able to make people not like them, if the left is also not, I don't know. It just doesn't work, because I mean, unless they put everything to the left of, I don't even know, like the left of just like the most right-wing Tories, then even then it doesn't really work. But like this rhetoric that people are being used, that people use fear to make them not choose this path of masculinity, is completely the opposite, because again, like as your sort of Cascady are mentioning, is that like young conservative English cis men, right, very specifically, and even Tories, like older Tories, can very easily constantly define themselves against or with Winston Churchill, right? It's not like there's like an inability to. In fact, even more so in America, there's a desire to identify with him. So I don't understand that.
Yes.
They are taking these people entirely out of context. Winston Churchill, for example, let's talk about his like beliefs around eugenics, or at least his support at some stages for certain eugenics. What people don't understand now, and this is really left capitalizing on the utter intellectual inadequacy of many Americans and many people around the world now, is the field of eugenics at the time was not seen as it is now.
The way I see it, right? It's more. Did he at one point in his life support eugenics? Yes. Was he a perfect person? No. Do I support his support of? Do I support his support of eugenics? No. At the same time, do I think that he's still, despite that, a better role model for kids than Andrew Tate and Sneeko? Yes.
I mean, completely discounting the man's achievement just because he dabbled in a field that, again, as I said, was proved only later to be as disastrous as it was. And again, we can't view these people. It seems today that it's so easy to discount any achievements people make simply because they're not completely and entirely perfect.
Yeah, this is the exact same thing that they always try to do. It's like, oh, they want you to be a saint if you're on the left, which is not true because right wingers don't care if you point out their hypocrisy. In fact, they really don't care about that. They don't care about being hypocrites. They operate on hypocrisy. But this is like a weird framing because of the fact that it just it doesn't make any sense. Well, one, it's weird to have them in opposition to Sneeko and Andrew Tate, which I'm not even going to get into that. But it's like it's a weird thing to hold them up against those two things and then say, well, his like one minor issue, quote unquote, was his belief in eugenics. No. He of course operated on that thought, which hasn't gone away. It's still standard part and parcel of Western thought, if one, so to speak. To the point where, like what happened in Bengal, for example, let alone all of the things which happened in Africa and the rest of the world that was colonized by the British. So to like refer to it as like, oh, it was just this like intellectual thing that pursuit that he had, and is minor because of that, is again completely depriving the historical reality of Winston Churchill and eugenics as they existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Like that's literally denying the fact that is still more or less, right? Like it still is like criticizing Hitler for being mean to his staff but hand waving it away as a product of his time. Like, right, exactly. It's like how can you say that, like, oh well, it's just this intellectual like esoteric thing? No, it was not, right? Yeah, exactly, exactly, Cascady. Like that goes against the evidence that we have historically of what he did, and also the policies which under his government, his time in government, right, enacted, both as the head of the armed forces, like during World War I, and also as like foreign secretary in later on before World War II. So like that's just not. I mean, it's just not true on any grounds for that. But also, it's like saying that, well, as long as everything else was good. Well, again, that adding in those values, right? Like, how are we going to valorize what is good and what is bad, right? As being only dependent upon whether or not at some point people call it out as being bad. Is only it does not put the onus on the individual in question, but instead puts the onus on this, like, I don't know, it's very much liberal idealism, right? It's this idea that, like, well, like, there are these ideas that will, like, see themselves in or out, but man can somehow be separate from it. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. Again, this is the problem with liberalism, in that it likes to view itself as being outside of ideology, even though it functionally operates on it constantly. It's let the marketplace of ideas judge them. Like, oh, it's not their fault that they went to this store at that time, because this store hadn't opened yet and bought it out. Like, I don't even know how else to word it, but that's just what comes to mind.
We want perfect role models because we see so much imperfection in ourselves and the people around us that we so desperately look towards. You can see on the internet. And that this brings us back to our Andrew Tate and Sneeko points. Andrew Tate, what he's presenting himself to be is the perfect man for young reactionary men that are so desperate looking for a role model. He not only taps into their desire to be as strong and masculine and rich, even, but he also taps into their severe disdain of what society has made them, per se, and the fact, and really female standards now. And he taps into the anger.
This is okay. So we got the misogyny at the end. The standards are patriarchal, right? Like, they are based in the patriarchy. They are based in, again, this is literally saying that, what, like, this is taking what Andrew Tate, etc. say as though it is the case, and saying, well, he must be responding to something which is true, which it's not. But it's saying that, yeah, I mean, it's literally right-wing framing, right? It's reactionary framing about women, saying that, oh, well, their standards are so high that they make it impossible unless men turn to someone like Andrew, right, to escape the matrix, quote unquote, to then become like a higher man, right? One could almost say an Ubermensch, right? A superman, right? An overman that then is above. I mean, we already know that he loves Nietzsche, so I can make that illusion for sure. Or at least he purports to like Nietzsche. He's never really read Nietzsche, but anyway, that's besides the point. So, but it's still the problem of women for having those standards. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Uh, oh, he loves Nietzsche. I know, I know. I mean, he claims to love Nietzsche. I mean, it's this. I mean, he's like, oh, like, I've read this, but he's essentially maybe read maybe like a chapter of the birth of a tragedy, maybe. Um, Most likely, he probably just watched videos of people talking about Nietzsche, but I mean,
He taps into the hatred that young men feel at these institutions and at these societal phenomena. But rather,
it is interesting though that he does use the word hatred, because again, like, the misogynistic comment at the end is further substantiated by his terming of it as being hatred, right? That it's like, oh, they hate the standards that women have, as if those quote unquote standards were not actually based in patriarchal and, misogynistic structures in the first place. So I don't know. It's like, it's weird too, because then this whole thing is about how masculinity is in crisis. And then he's trying to, like, oppose Andrew and Sneeko. But now he's saying, like, in effect, he's saying that Andrew is speaking to something. So he's correct, but he's just going about it the wrong way. And Peter the Great and Winston Churchill went about it the correct way, which is just such a weird way of putting. I mean, I would have never have. I don't know.
rather than capitalizing it for the greater good, which I don't think anybody can say Tate does anything for the greater good. It's all a way to benefit himself. But rather than doing that, all he serves to do is sow even more division within young men, makes them just hateful and reactionary, and usually doesn't steer them towards success, simply because it benefits his own pockets, and he doesn't provide any real more higher moral framework. He doesn't tap into anything Apollonian. He simply really reduces his fans into someone that's completely driven only by their, testosterone and passions,
Yeah.
and not by any real intellectual.
Man, I never thought that we would get to the point where we would start repeating like literally 18th and 19th century things to talk about like human expression, right? It's like, yes, their testosterone and passions, like it's like, are you suffering from the vapors? It's just like, oh gosh, we are truly in a time of very interesting things. But again, it's very strange to be like, well, it only benefits him, as if Winston Churchill did everything he did selflessly, right? It's like, another thing too is that it's still under the assumption that the aristos, right, in aristocrat, right, which is meant to be like the best, right, somehow does have some actuality to it, right? That they are selfless, right? This is like literally taking what is like very basic, like understandings of like tragedy, of Greek tragedy, right? That like a noble person falls, right? And that's like what happens in a Greek tragedy, right? Which is why I think that he at least read some of the birth of tragedy, because he's using the term Apollonian, and he'll use Dionysian too. But in effect, that's what we have, right? Like that's what the issue is that because Andrew says to partake in acts that he sees as immoral, right? Which are just having doing things with other people, etc., that somehow that equals bad, right? But these two other figures somehow did everything they wanted out of the goodness of their hearts, which is just not the, like, how can anyone talk about the building of St. Petersburg, right, built by Peter, right, that involved so much death and destruction of innocent people that were forced to work to build it, to turn that marshland that it was on, it was like essentially swamps, right, to put the foundations where now the city is on the Neva River. Like, I don't know how someone could be like, that was done selflessly. No, obviously not.
Or moral integrity, like real male role models should be. Peter the Great, for example, a huge and strong man. However, he championed a lot of intellectualism in Russia. He ushered in a new age. And although, especially if we look at his sex life, he wasn't perfect, just like Tate. But what I'm saying here is he does not need to be perfect. He at least did try to champion some of those ideals.
Yes.
And that's.
I don't know. It's kind of weird to me that like the people that are the most like moralistic about sex and stuff like that, and this is me speaking as someone who's ace, take such a weird interest in people's sex lives. It's like they want to find something there, right? As if like they could have a quote unquote perfect, or like, I don't even know how to phrase it. It's just like how does, I mean, but these are things that come down to masculinity, right? These are things that are framed as being part of masculinity. One of them being like championing, right, as if that's really what he did, intellectual movements, right, having a capacious knowledge. Same thing with, like, I don't even have to and again, a lot of this is based in misogyny, but also whiteness, etc., white supremacy, etc. But it is weird what he then chooses as the example for, like, this is where he failed, and it's his sex life, because it's like, why even care about that? Like, that's like shouldn't that be the least important thing? But it's weird to then put it at the forefront and say, like, but this is where he's wrong, because then it tells you what he values, right? And it's like, what he sees as bad about Sneeko and Andrew Tate is not that they're fake role models, but rather that they're fake because they seek personal gain that he can recognize from advertising, I guess, from marketing that they have to do. Excuse me. And then also that they do things which cross his moral line, right? Or at least what he says is his moral line, right? And it happens to do with sex, and only with that. Like, that is just so strange to me. It's like, I don't care if you committed actual genocide, as long as you kept it to, like, you know, missionary position in the bedroom, you're perfect. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that just, like, how does that even work? Like, I just don't know. Like, to me, that just sounds so weird. I don't know. That's just like,
That's what Tate really lacks. He is wishy-washy with religion. Went through multiple ones. I think he began Protestant. His brother became Orthodox while he became Muslim, and both have, you know, flip-flopped on their faith so many times because they simply use faith as a means to an end rather than an actual life philosophy, which is what it is.
I would agree. I have 2 points to make. The one about Andrew Tate's sort of capitalization of vulnerable young men. I would agree with that. I think the biggest upset from the left that I've seen recently is that they're not saying, hey, young men are being, you know, tainted by these bad role models. They're instead saying we should protect everyone else from these young men who are being tainted. There's no...
it's interesting that he frames it this way, because it still is putting the onus on other people, right? It's like, the issue is not that young white men are becoming reactionary. No, it's the fact that people don't let these young men who have become reactionaries just be be accepted back into society in general, which is not even true. Like for leftists, that's one thing, right? For actual communists, that's one thing. For, like, just society at large, that's completely a lie. Like, that's just, I think the issue is, like, they think that being, like, obnoxiously edgy, right, and people not willing to tolerate that is the same as somehow them not wanting you to participate in society, which is not true. Like, that literally doesn't make sense. Like, I feel like this conversation is eventually going to lead to, like, well, I probably won't, but it might go to, like, the idea of, like, canceling, right, in quotes, masculinity. That, like, oh, well, they get rid of people who say the actual thing, right, that say the good masculinity, by chasing them off the internet, quote unquote, right, with by canceling them. But that's not even true, right? Like, the people that uphold the patriarchal structures that are just, like, the baseline in particularly in the imperial core, have free reign, right? Like, in fact, they have a good friend in the owner of Twitter, right? So yeah, like, this just doesn't, like, this is literally like, oh gosh, it's like that one meme. I can't remember how it goes, but, like, I can't think of the image in my head right now, but it's literally, why won't people let me be edgy, and why won't they be friends with me anymore, right? It's like, why can't I be an edgy boy once I'm in my 20s or whatever, right? It's like, no, because like, you need to be serious, right? And it's like, that's really what's coming off from this, is like, like if people don't let me be a big special boy, even like in situations where that's not what this is about, somehow it's their fault for not realizing that actually it's their fault, right? Like that just. I'm thinking of the Goose one, who let you say what? Right, yeah, like that one's good too. That one, okay. You know, like the one where it's like the boy and he's like playing the trombone and like the girl's like covering her ears. It's like these are those dudes, right? Like these two dudes are that one dude with the trombone, right? And they're like, why can't I keep doing this, right? Like why can't I keep doing this? Because doing this is based in red pilled, and it's like because people like other people don't like it, and they're like, how dare they not like it, right? It's just like I don't know. It's just like this is why many people describe the people that are masculinists, right? In this particularly in this very yeah, it's a kind of sea lining, right? Exactly. Like the people that partake in this particular. Okay, now I'm just doing lots of consonants, but anyway, right? That they like to state this, right? Why they compare them to being very childish, right? They're very childish because it's literally I don't want to have to take other people's thoughts and feelings into consideration. They should understand that I know. Yeah, how dare other people have standards? Which is what he said like 10 minutes ago or whatever, however long ago, about women, right? That it's like men wouldn't be these reactionary right wingers if women didn't have such high standards, right? Like women have such high standards, so it's their fault that Andrew Tate and Sneeko exist. Like that doesn't even make sense. Um, again, it's literally saying like toxic masculinity exists not because of patriarchy, not because of misogyny, but because of the victims of patriarchy and misogyny, right? Like you know what I mean? Like that's literally how like that this is what this entire conversation is, right? It's just justification for I mean, again, it's like why did they have to put a sword there, right? It signifies right a particular type of masculinity that they want to identify with. Most straight women no, I accept less than the bare minimum. I mean, like the strange thing is that like they will be endlessly online, right? Be endlessly talking about how they go to the gym, do all of this, but it's like, oh, care about what others think and feel? Oh God, no. It society is decaying if they're making me think about what other people think and feel. Because like even there's I like having the sword there, right? Which I still think is like important to just analyze it even for just a quick second, right? Is that it's a specific kind of masculinity that they want that is incumbent upon us to accept uncritically and that can be changed at a moment's notice, right? By them. But if we take any issue with it, then it's our fault, right? And that is a colonialist mentality, right? That is a white supremacist mentality, right? That like we get to be however we want to be. If you take an issue with it, then you have to suffer the consequences, right? So this is just like affirming, right? The like white supremacist masculinist position, right? By saying, uh, is this the meme? Let's see. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. That's hilarious. States' rights to what? Yeah, exactly, exactly. Like we need good male role models for what though? Like what do you? Yeah, like I mean, kind of. I mean, maybe I wouldn't necessarily word it quite like that, but that's the example I found. I know there's another one where the dude is like, the left wants to cancel me for my opinions, and the goose is like, which opinion? Yeah, exactly. That's literally what they're saying. Like, women have too high standards. High standards about what? right? Like, which ones? Like, tell us which ones. And then typically they will say something that's very stereotypical, right? That's like the whole like stupid 666 thing, right? Or the whole whatever, right? Like, one, that's something that is almost always imposed by other men, right? By cis men, right? Upholding toxic masculinity. Like, cis men are the ones that create these paradigms by which they use to oppress other men. Um, and they're based in, right, patriarchy. It's not, it's like, it's complaining about patriarchy and then doing misogyny instead, right? Which is par for the course, really. But it is one of those, and I think to me that's a very good example, Cascady. Like, yeah, like opinions about what, why is it that just like it's just their sexual morality, and of course, it's only those who are coded as having committed quote unquote like straight, right, transgressions, right? Like, oh, if he slept with lots of women, that's acceptable. But like neither of the two people are coded as queer, right? So, right, like they specifically chose two men that are not coded as queer. Perhaps, I mean, I would say for a good reason, because they don't identify that as being within their ambit of masculinity, right? So, like that's why like all these things just keep metastasizing, right, and just keep exposing more and more of like their thought process.
This whole issue started with these young men feeling alienated,
Completely,
and
yeah.
some on the left are trying to alienate them even more instead of trying to help them to genuinely better themselves and move past that sort of bad role model.
Exactly.
They are villainizing them,
Yes.
making them the issue rather than helping them be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, the left really does fear young men.
I agree.
Young men are an incredibly powerful force. Throughout history, they have been used as really the foot soldiers of empire. Anyway, young men are reaching their physical.
Imagine saying, like, imagine actually saying that, as he just did, that young men are dangerous because they have been the foot soldiers of empires. Okay, like, that's why. That's why it's bad. Because they've been the foot soldiers for empire. That's why people are afraid. It's not because, oh, you're obnoxious online or whatever. Although that doesn't help either. How come Churchill and Peter the Great get to be held to the standard of their time, but women don't get to parrot things that are published literally every issue of Cosmo or Vogue yeah, exactly. Or every TV show. Oh yeah, because of course, like, heaven forbid that women, of course, speak about things which are in popular culture, right? Like, again, like that's a very good point too. That women are not held to the same standards of their time, and nor are queer people, right? Like they are not held to they are not understood in the context of their time, right? That's something that like Foucault had to discuss, right? In the three recently published fourth volume of the history of sexuality, right? But among other texts too, right? It's like, oh, like we must not like people will look back at historical figures who did queer things, but will use categories of identity that didn't exist at the time, right? Like that's one very easy way of sort of like explaining that. But for this idea of masculinity, it involves doing that, right? But it's only applicable to queer people, to non-cis het white males, right? Like they get to be given this like, oh, conditional relative understanding, but everybody else has to be held in this rigid one, right? And so I mean it's also the same thing too, like they are trying to be the metonym, right? The stand-in in some sense, right? For all young men of all time, as if the idea of young men, right, goes back equally back in time, which is not true. as if they are still not the foot soldiers of empire, which they are, and as if these structures are not reinforcing themselves through their very like the idea of this crisis of masculinity, because this is something you can actually read in about that happened in the lead up to German fascism, right? In the book Belonging and Genocide. Excuse me. With the first two chapters actually, you have the myth of camaraderie and the attack on masculinity, where it's like two of the big things that they needed ideologically to sort of sell the German fascist ideas, right? Was one, this idea that there was this connection between the people suffering now and the people that fought in the past, right, during like the creation of Germany, etc., vis-a-vis the like First World War, right? Hence why like the Freikorps, right, specifically, were the most reactionary of the bunch, and eventually most of them became members of the SS or members of the SA or party members, right? And then you have the crisis of masculinity, which is to say that outside forces, and I hope I need not go into detail, are the ones that are causing masculinity to be threatened, right? That there's like an essential German masculinity that goes back to ancient times, and you can, like, this is why I wanted to say it was in the Reichskanzlerei, but which is the chancellery, which is like the main office building for, Mustache Man, that they had like hanging these huge like banners, right, with quotes from Germania, right, which is a text written by Tacitus. So the thing about Tacitus's Germania is that he essentially does the like society is weak and everybody's a soy boy and blah blah blah. And interesting enough, he writes this just when Rome is about to become at the height of its empire. So it's like completely untrue. It's like right before the like century and a half of Roman apogee. But he writes it by using another people, right? The people of Germania Magna, right? The Germanic peoples, which all that means is like the German peoples or the Germanic peoples. That just means that they spoke a Germanic language or they speak German. That's all what that means. Especially now, right? Because ethno-nationalism is just dumb. But anyway, so they took what he wrote fictionally about a place he had never been to, and then took it as fact about themselves as a standard they had to be held up to in terms of masculinity. And this sounds very much like that same concept, just now there were other, right, outside forces. And it also doesn't help that the two figures that they are using are also people that aren't necessarily that aren't white, right? They aren't people that are just like, oh yes, they're et cetera, right? They aren't racialized, or rather they are racialized, right? And so that is another thing. Like, it's strange that the two figures they do choose are two people that caused immense suffering and colonialism, right? And then to say that that young men are dangerous because they are the foot soldiers of empire, which of course means European colonialism, because I would be certain to say that GigaChad here would be against the idea of revolution, right, of liberation from those empires. I mean, we actually do know that, but also that the figures that are like the selling, right, the bad masculinity, are people that aren't considered white, or aren't completely considered white. In the case of like Andrew Tate, for example, right? So I do think that the choices that they're making say so much, right? Like, they're leaving so much said by by not saying.
Potential. they are realizing it. Another thing the left is deeply scared of, in how many articles you see of, why is the far right so obsessed with bodybuilding? Why is the far right so obsessed with physical fitness? 10 signs your child's a far right extremist, aka they take care of themselves.
Literally,
No,
you.
but real, like my grandmother sends me these articles. I'm not even joking. And that's what they're doing. They're demonizing good qualities because they're scared of strength. The left really.
Imagine being such a fascist that your own grandmother is like, honey, these articles are telling me that you're a far right winger, and your take from that is you just don't like strength. I mean, that takes some serious like if his own grandmother is like, I'm concerned about you, that says a lot.
In foundation, this is a little bit more of a controversial belief, but I really do think that left wing ideology, its philosophical base is really the antithesis to strength. True conservative thought ideals strength. It makes the strong man the ideal, while the left is there to kind of focus on aiding the weak. Really, conservative thought is based in the aristocratic ideals before really the Enlightenment, while the left is the force that has continued driving thought since then.
Yeah.
And I do see them as two fundamentally polar parts. So do they both have a place in society?
So see, now what we're getting is, excuse me, the left is against the strong man, right? Written in italics, right? With the S and the M in strong and man, right? Capitalized. Which he earlier said was tied to fascism. And leftism is against it because it represents the weak, who is literally everybody else that is not a strong man. And who I guess is not a foot soldier of empire as well, in the case of young men. So, like, we can discern a lot from what they're saying precisely because of how they're framing it. But to say that this is again what only proves that they would be against the idea of liberation, because they don't, both of them don't, or I really just Giga Chat, we can be certain, does not believe that liberation is actually possible, right? That if the colonial empire has stolen all of your land, then that's just how it is, right? This is such a white supremacist mindset that it's not even it's actually really concerning to then be like, my grandmother is concerned about me, that she sends me articles saying that are you a fascist, honey? That's just a huge self-report, in my opinion, anyway. But again, it's this idea that the left is against something that is completely devoid of its context, right? I'm just going to be quite honest with you. There is hardly a leftist that I do know that does not work out. In fact, even the other leftist streamers that I know are known for working out. NCC does kickboxing, right? You know what I mean? This idea that the left is somehow slovenly, right? Lethargic, right? It's is on one hand is what they argue, but then they also say that the left is violent and rapacious and you know what I mean? It's well, how can you be? Yeah, working out is healthy. And if anybody is concerned about the health of the people and the health at large, it's the left. It's not the right wing, right? The right wing is about having that's why I think that this constantly bringing up the aristocratic ideal as if one, it was accessible to people prior to liberalism being installed as the Weltanschauung of the world, right? Is completely false. Like, we have to remember that, like, when what he's talking about was something that was available to maybe 1% of the population at most, and saying that when times were like this and someone could actually rule the entire power structure or the entire society, right, by themselves, that's when men actually had to be strong. But now, because we live in liberalism, which so is not about competition. I promise you guys, capitalism is not about like endless competition. It's actually about lots of cooperation and like, yeah. Capitalism is totally interested in us, like, yeah. It's just, I don't know. It's just this very strange, like, and because he's juxtaposing them, right? He just said, right, they're polar opposites. But he's saying that, like, fascists are concerned with working out, but it's not that working out is the issue. It's that the misogynistic, transphobic, queerphobic, right, like all of these things that exist in Jim Bro culture that then result in them becoming right wing, right? It's like where the ideological and the physical, so to speak, where you're getting an ideological education along with your physical education, to put it that way, that's pointing that out somehow is against the working out. And it's like, no, it's literally leftists saying, if even that, if we can even say leftists are saying this, because I would say that leftists have always been saying this. I would argue is that fascism, wherever it finds a fertile ground, right, to expose new people to it, it will use that ground to do so, right? So like the fact that it is in like Jim Bro video, particularly online Jim Bro, it's not even like necessarily at any particular gym, rather it's through the online culture about the gym, right? So that is what also pokes a hole in that. It's like, it's not like leftists are there protesting gyms, but instead it's saying that the worst bits of toxic masculinity, if leftists don't start fitness cults or go their protein drink pyramid schemes. I'll give him that. That's true. Right? Like pyramid schemes and leftism are two things that like don't usually go together. I will, but to say that we're against strength, right, and to particularly use it in the strong man, again, as I said, in italics with the S and M capitalized, right, is exactly what he said earlier. But now he's just saying like anything that isn't right wing, anything that isn't fascist, essentially, that in his mind opposes the strong man, is against, right, these ideals, and is against masculinity as such, which is one, just completely false. But again, it's understanding, and presupposing that masculinity as they idealize it is the masculinity that is like this like eternal thing, like this eternal concept, right? Like I've mentioned this before in case of the Spartans, right? That they always lived in the shadow of the fictional depictions of the Spartans. Like they were never, like, Leonidas was not like the Leonidas in the book, the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides, right? Like it was not like that. And we know this from contemporary evidence from Spartans themselves, right? That this was not the case. But what people use to remember the Spartans are just these myths, right? And so it's like saying we want to believe the myth and act as though it's true, and only allow those, because that also comes with corollaries, right? that means for like the United States, right? The myths of the founding of the United States must be accepted because they approach masculinity. They approach, right? The idea of being a citizen, the idea of being, all of these things, right? As being based in this myth. Hello, DJ. Welcome in. Welcome in. Thank you so much for lurking. And so by juxtaposing against that, right, by saying that people that question those things are fundamentally questioning these, like it's like on one hand, it is true that leftists question those myths, those foundational myths, right, of America, of all white, white supremacist, white colonial, settler colonial states, right? Because we know that it's not true, right? Especially those of us who are colonized people, right, and are marginalized, etc. Like we can see through bits of the myth, right? And so, like the indigenous peoples, right? And that's funny because that's what the Spartans said about themselves. They needed for the militarized state administered slave states to have produced world beating wonder soldiers. Otherwise, why give up ever having days off? Right. I mean, like it was based on this idea of like, well, this is what we like, this ideal, right? And like the Atticans, right, the Athenians, they just took it as like whatever their stories say must be the truth. Well, even saying that is, but it's like, I mean, it's like it's kind of like when we were talking about Ignatius Donnelly, right? Where it's like he takes what Plato wrote as being the truth, even though Plato wrote it, and Plato isn't in the work, and it's not used in the way that he mentions it, right? So it's like, and again, sort of what you're saying, Sundry Lankar, is that yeah, it's like the militarized state administered slave state, right, is like the same thing with imperialism, right? Like what allows upper middle class like white dudes like him to say that the problem is that the socialism is when no gym, right? Is that it requires a massive structure of imperialism, right? And all of the violences, right, that it commits in many different and longitudinal forms, right, that go throughout the generations, that are also based in colonialism, etc. That then allow for like this idea that, oh well, if we could just concentrate power even more, right, then we would be able to solve the problems of society, as opposed to actually addressing what's happening in society, right? So yeah, it's like also part of that. I mean, this just goes to show like what I was saying earlier, and what people are saying in chat is that like, in order to believe this, you have to buy all of the things about Western ideology about itself, and then say, oh well, the spectacle of politics in the Congress halls, right, in the parliaments of Europe and in the United States, etc., right, that's real, and that represents an actual struggle between the left and the right, which it doesn't. Um, I don't know. It's just like really, I don't know. It's just, this is,
Yes, naturally, a nation will have both right and left, something pushing for the strength of the individual and the strength of the higher few, versus ensuring that the masses are not abused by, the Ubermensch, if we want to bring in Nietzsche.
Oh my gosh. I was 100% right. Like when I said, it almost sounds like he's talking about the Ubermensch. I knew he was going to bring it up. I'm like, of course. But see, this is also the thing too, is that he includes himself in the Ubermensch, right? Like that is the thing, is that you cannot is that the idea that he's part of the masses, right, which is something that leftists we take as, or rather it's something that, especially if we read Mao and if we read Lenin, etc., we definitely, is something we take to heart, I would expect, right? Is this idea that we are part of the masses, right? Is that and to have faith in the masses, and to, et cetera, et cetera, right? I don't want to just keep quoting Mao's, speeches and stuff from the Little Red Book, but and I mean, even Che Guevara, for example, right, speaks about this, the love for the people, etc. And this is the exact opposite. This is saying that instead, if we had in like an introspective, navel gazing elite, right, that was just dudes, right, that was just like buff white dudes, right, that were traditional and based, then the world would somehow correct itself, because they would get to put forth their ideas in the world. But that's just like, that's pretending as if that's not what capitalism, colonialism, etc. has not done. But it's fundamentally a thing that the petit bourgeoisie has always had in relation to the bourgeoisie, right? Is that the petit bourgeoisie wants to join the big bourgeoisie, right? And it fears being proletarianized. So then it becomes more and more reactionary, right, to avoid that. In particular, by adopting the language of crisis. And this isn't to say the like idea that fascism is a uniquely petit bourgeois phenomenon, because it wasn't. Like, hello, non tofu, welcome in. Like, it is not to say that fascism is unique, like kind of like the Bordiga hypothesis, right? Instead, it's the fact that the most ardent supporters of the of this idea that they can of admitting themselves sort of into the idea of like the new aristocracy is something that is of great concern to the petit bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie can already do that, right? And they already have in most cases. So instead, it's the petit bourgeoisie that wants to partake in it. So like, it's weird, because if you take a Marxist analysis of this, and again, I'm doing this all on the spot, so I know my analysis might not be the best and can definitely be corrected, and added onto by other thinkers and other people, right? It's like, with other thinkers and with other people, is that it would require us to then imagine that if there was to be a new aristocracy, right, of Giga Chads only, that this Giga Chad would be admitted in, right? Which is exactly what, I mean, that is very much along the same lines of thought that a lot of reactionary thinkers take, right? It's like, we can create a new aristocracy that includes you, right? And that was always a useful marketing tool, especially for Daré, who wrote like the New Aristocracy of Blood and Soil, for example. And I'm just quoting the title, right? Where it's like, oh, well, actually, the aristocracy is the people who can XYZ, right? And it's like, this is the same logic, but it's saying that it specifically has to be right wing young men, right, that will, as it were, inherit this aristocratic ideal. And it just isn't true, especially if you want to talk about things that go back to ancient times, right? Like, ancient masculinity, whatever that might even be, right, is only understood through the present. So to even begin to try to describe things through these terms is a fundamental misunderstanding, right? It's one that lacks, a historical understanding, right? Because it's the belief that masculinity, the further back you go, the more real it was, which just doesn't even make sense. Because the accoutrements, right, the things that were added on to masculinity since ancient times, right, like modern gyms, for example, or even the obsession with particular forms of masculinity, are present day things, right? Things that only started in the 19th century or in the 18th century, right? Like one of those was like in relation to colonization of the Americas. the Spaniards began to place they placed particular value of masculinity on their beards when they encountered the indigenous peoples, particularly in the Andes and what is now like Ecuador, Peru. um, they met people who instead put the emphasis on the length of their hair, right? Having long, hair, as cis men, at least as we can describe it now historically, right? And that they were upset by that, right? And that they did not like that they did not attune themselves to what they thought masculinity was. Um, but they were not, as it were, held to the same standard by the indigenous peoples, right? So, like, not to go too deep into the weeds because I feel that we are, but like that is one of the great problems with people trying to look into history and trying to come up with a definition of what any concept is that like, oh, people look at them and say, oh, see, beards are a way of measuring masculinity, but even that's contingent, right? So many things are contingent upon so many other things that it would be too soon to immediately say one determines the other, right? Because you have two clashing ideas, but the one that's most like the one that's seen as most close to European ideals, right, or Western ideals, quote unquote, would be the one with the beard, right? But the one with the length of the hair, again, I'm just juxtaposing these two just for a quick, rundown of something that happened during the colonial period, right? Is that that did not mean, however, that when the fashion turned and people started to shave, right, in European countries and also in European colonies, that somehow that their masculinity went away, right? It just became embodied in something else, right? Like in many different things, right? Like, so, like, even trying to determine which things of masculinity you want to choose are contingent upon what things now in the present, in this present moment, in your present social position, etc., right, people value as and consider masculine. um because then one also has to question, what do people consider not masculine? And that is and as soon as you create this opposition, right, then it becomes even more difficult to uphold these ideas, right? That there is such a thing as masculinity as such, right? Like there is such a static concept. Instead, you begin to realize that it's linked to so many other things that it's wrong to try to speak of it as though it has a static or at least a stable conceptual history. So,
The left, in having that foundation, a foundation that most people don't understand, we have to take what they say with a grain of salt on this issue. Because young men, realistically, are naturally going to be right wing. As they come into their,
I don't mean to keep post champing, but there's just so many self reports here, right? Like, young men will end up being or tend to be right wing. And I think that that's not the case. I don't think that that can be said about, because see, and I don't mean to go off onto another long tangent, but it's another question of like, when he means young men, right? When he says young men, who is he talking about? Is it young men writ large in the entire world? Because we know that that's not the case, right? Um, but if he's talking about young men that he imagines are just like him, then like the people that are just like him, right, in his, at the college he goes to or whatever, because they are all quote unquote right wing, right? And I'm just putting that in quotes because I would say that even things that are considered left wing to him are still right wing, right? Like liberalism is a right wing. um, it's then strange to say that, well, everybody else that's a young man, excuse me, young men are naturally going to be right wing. Damn, I didn't know the right wing was naturally about playing Fortnite. Right, like that's what I like I apologize for always stopping to like think about and conceptualize what people and other people are trying to say, but it's like I actually want to, like, and excuse me for just a second ago, is because I want to sort of like go through the thought process, at least to some extent, of like how can this conclusion be arrived to, right? And Fortnite, Fortnite is like the ultimate right wing game. No, but just ask you, do you play Fortnite? Okay, no, but and of course, playing Stardew Valley is the exact opposite, right? It's like only leftists play Stardew Valley. But no, like it becomes a question of definition, which is something you never like in a debate, and this is true. It's like you don't get into a, you don't want to play the semantics game, but because this is a podcast and because he does video essays, we can conclude from the evidence he has presented that when he says young men, he means people just like him in more ways than one, right? So
Their maturity, as they come into their physical maturity, they're realizing how beautiful physical strength is, the true capability of physical strength and intellectual strength, balancing two worlds, and they have to learn how to use that power properly. Young men are stronger than young women, and they have to learn to use that properly. It would be a terrible society of pure anarchy if young men had no moral code holding them back. Because, for example, like look at when the Germans were just let loose on civilians during the Second World War. These were young men driven by an ideology that is based in absolute raw primal strength of the young man. It is pretty much the
I have never heard, like, that is the, I'm sorry, that's just like a weird way of talking about Nazism, is to literally say what it was just like the primal urge of young masculinity. That's all it was. And it was against civilians, like just civilians, as if, like, how often is physical strength used in a bullshit way like this? All the time. I mean, he made an entire video. I mean, in relation to him, all the time. In U.S. society in general, all the time. Like when I lived in the global South, right, and I've lived in multiple, like my homeland, quote unquote, right, is Mexico. They don't, like, this doesn't really get brought up, right? Like this is like I have never really encountered people that are like this, right? Only when I come to America and to the West, right, quote unquote, suddenly these things somehow become of great importance as a physical, well, right, but it's used as it's used as something to discriminate, right? Because right away he's like, well, I'm going to be biologically essentialist, right? And saying that young men are blah blah blah, but that also, right, is ableist and blah. I'm stronger than a lot of men. Does that mean, right? It's like creating these categories that if people transcend them, or not, maybe not even transcend, right, but that show that the categorizing lines, right, the boxes that right, that the walls between them, right, are not as deep set as he might imagine, that therefore, therefore we are questioning some ancient structure that if we just attuned ourselves to it, right, oh, because you're stronger than a lot of men, that means that you need to hide that, right, and instead compensate that, right, like that is how he would think, right, like that is a very common colonialist, right, way of thinking, right, particularly with when it came to women embodying positions of power that might have put them in charge of men in some way, or that and something like that, right? Um, so it's not strange that he brings it up, but it's because then it counts as a justification, right? It's a biologically essentialist justification for his misogyny, right? Because as he just said, right, like, well, if cis men are stronger than cis women, then that must mean that any higher, right? It's kind of like Jordan Peterson, right? Like, it's his idea of that. Well, hierarchies are kind of like inborn into like it doesn't matter if, regardless of however we were to run the societal experiment, let's say, right? We would end up getting the same pyramidal structure of society, right? Because lobsters pee from their face or something like that, right? Um, that is in essence what he's trying to do, right? But he's trying to use human beings, right? Like but like between you and me, if you are stronger than me, that has no bearing on how well you stream, right? Yeah, exactly. Like, those two things don't have an influence on one another, right? But he's trying to say that it does, right? Yeah, exactly. The logic falls off so fast, but that's precisely why this lack of logic instead appeals, right, to things that are seen as natural, right? This is why it tries to naturalize hierarchy, right? By saying, oh, well, the ancients already had this ideal, and we've strayed from this ideal. Going out to get lunch, but want to send love in case you finish by the time. Oh, thank you so much, Judas. I'll see you soon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Judas. I appreciate that. But yeah, it's like, just because you have, just because you have people that, well, so the reason why he's trying to equate these things together is because, again, it's trying to appeal, right? Saying that shows of strength, right, can be naturalized and then be seen as indicative of a natural